Good afternoon. I'm Vince Velazquez, and welcome to Law&Crime Network's Keeping the Peace, where from a law enforcement perspective, we're tackling today's important issues relating to social justice and law enforcement reform. As protests continue around the country, an NYPD officer is in big trouble. He's been arrested and charged with the assault of a female protester. This viral video shows the officer, Vincent D'Andraia, pushing the woman to the ground. Let's take a look. Man, it's a tough video to watch, so we're going to get into it. But before we do that, I want to introduce my guest today, Kirk Burkhalter. He's been on the show before. He's a friend of the show, retired NYPD detective, lawyer, and now law professor. Welcome to the show, Kirk.
My pleasure, Vince. How are you?
I'm great, man. Thank you for coming on. And looking at the video, I've seen it before. Literally, I saw it. I think I saw it when it was happening live on TV when I was watching the protest. One observation I have with this, and you were NYPD for many years, is now the officer, what he did, Officer Vincent, the officer that pushed the lady down, he was wrong for doing that. But then if you look at the video closely, there's a supervisor in a white shirt. I would imagine that this supervisor had to have seen this. What's your take on that? What's his responsibility? This officer's been charged, but what about the supervisor that didn't do anything about it?
Oh, Vince, you're dead on, and that's the first thing that struck me. I've mentioned before, my father is a retired sergeant. He's a supervisor, and he always expressed to me that his number one job was to manage personnel, to manage the folks under him, to maintain firearms control and the use of force. So that is something I find disturbing because that is the methodology by which the police department holds its members accountable. I'm not going to do X because my supervisor is going to discipline me. And in this particular case, not knowing all the facts, just looking at the video, this supervisor continued to walk on. So that's disturbing. And I would certainly expect that he will probably face some type of discipline from the department. The other is the lack of arrest. Police officers are allowed to use the net force necessary to maintain the police and make an arrest. Here, there was no arrest. If the police felt that force was justified, why wasn't that woman, the victim, subsequently arrested? Why did everyone walk on? So those are the two questions that jump out at me.
That's a good point. And I understand that that supervisor actually has been transferred. As far as punishment, I don't know if that fits the bill. But that was a good learning moment as a supervisor to make sure that that's corrected on the spot, because it's not only correcting that officer, it's correcting or showing the correction to the other officers that are present. And you made a good point. There were no arrests, meaning the woman, if she did something that caused the officer to use force, pushing her down, then she must have committed a crime for him to apply that amount of force. He just basically left her there on the side of the road. It's pretty tragic. And this is happening. We're seeing this more and more, where people are getting tired of it and they are holding police officers criminally accountable. We're going to switch gears real quick to the Breonna Taylor case out of Louisville, Kentucky. The intel used to request a no-knock warrant for Breonna Taylor's home has been called into question since her death. Yesterday, the detective who sought the no-knock warrant has now been reassigned and placed on an administrative assignment, not leave. He's actually still working, but he's working in an office pushing paper. And as you know, police shot the 26-year-old EMT at least 8 times after breaking her door down. Let's see what the acting Louisville police chief had to say.
We've also gotten several questions regarding the investigation that led up to the death of Breonna Taylor. One of the areas those questions revolve around is the seeking of the search warrant that led officers to Ms. Taylor's residence on March 13th. Questions have been raised by the Taylor family, their attorneys, the postal inspector, and others about how and why the search warrant was approved. As a result of those questions, I have placed Detective Joshua Jaynes, who applied for the warrant, on administrative reassignment until those questions can be answered. This matter has also been referred to the FBI. This is all part of the process of getting to the truth of what happened that night and leading up to that night. I recognize the process takes longer than we would all want, but it's what must be done to ensure a thorough and fair investigation for everybody involved and to ensure this community has the best trust available for this police department. Thank you.
Well, so what we have now is we have the warrant itself is coming into question, the validity of it. I can only imagine that until they can get to the bottom of it, and I've done in my police career, I can't tell you how many warrants I was the affiant on and swore that out to a judge. And it's extremely important that your information is accurate, correct, and not stale. Kirk, I'm going to just kind of talk a little bit about, we ourselves here in Atlanta had a case similar to this where an elderly woman was shot and killed by the police on a faulty warrant. And to make matters worse, when they realized they were at the wrong house and they killed this old lady, they planted drugs, this is my own department, in Atlanta, in her basement to try to fix it. Those officers went to federal prison. With this particular case, the fact that they're looking at the information, what do you think? Is the information wrong? You know, did they have bolstered information? Is that information not accurate? Is it stale? What do you think?
Well, there seems to have been several failures here, and I am certainly in no way deflecting the responsibility from the police department. But it's important for our viewers to understand this process. Like yourself, Vince, I've applied with the affiant on warrants, more warrants than I could possibly ever remember. I served numerous search warrants. Some of them were no-knock warrants, certainly, because I was in the, certainly while I was in the narcotics division. However, here's the process. The police officer or detective who is applying for that warrant first, once again, must work with a supervisor. So the police officer just can't wake up in the morning or a detective and go down to court and get a warrant. Police officer has to inform their supervisor. It's the supervisor's duty to inspect or assess the validity of that information. Here, we know that the subject was in custody already. Then in most jurisdictions, what happens next is the police officer or detective doesn't go straight to court. They work with a district attorney, a local prosecutor, who once again reviews that information and inspects the validity of the information and determines what the proposed outcome will be. And then, as we both mentioned, as being affiants, you stand before a judge, a magistrate, and that person questions you and asks you about the information. Where does it come and what do you expect to receive? So, like I said, not focusing or deflecting from the police department, but it's important to understand that I think there were multiple failures here where there should, if you think about all those steps should be safeguards as opposed to just rubber stamps and passing this on.
Yeah, no doubt. And I have to say, like, yeah, I've done no-knock warrants, and historically looking back, the risk has to be greater than the reward. Mainly when the affiant or the police department is saying this is about destruction of evidence. I can see a no-knock warrant if it's a covert rescue of a hostage, and you just want to, you had information that's where they were, and you don't want to give them time to do harm to the hostage. But at the end of the day, I mean, we are responsible. Police officers are responsible for not just making sure they are safe, their team is safe, but even the people who you are going in to arrest. And this all goes back to even George Floyd, like a duty to make sure that even the people who you are basically taking, it's a Fourth Amendment issue. You're taking their freedom away. You still have a duty and a responsibility to make sure that those people remain safe. So we're going to take a break in a minute. When we come back from break, we're going to look at a New Jersey corrections officer who's been suspended for mocking George Floyd's death when we come back. Welcome back. New Jersey Corrections Officer Joseph DeMarco has been suspended after video shows the CO mocking George Floyd's death. The officer can be heard saying Black lives don't matter in the video. New Jersey Department of Corrections has condemned their employee, and the governor of New Jersey has strongly spoken out against the men in the video. Let's take a look at the video.
In a Philadelphia suburb in New Jersey, a group of men are seen on video mocking George Floyd's death by kneeling on his neck and shouting at Black Lives Matter protesters who passed by. One of the men in that video is a state corrections officer. Sydney Long of our affiliate WCAU reports.
At 3 o'clock Monday afternoon, a crowd of 60 to 80 demonstrators had a police escort to spread a Black Lives Matter message of unity and equality right here on Delsea Drive.
Overall, it was a really great experience in spite of what occurred. What we saw was disgusting.
What happened next was this: a group of people counter-protesting on private property decorated with Trump signs next to the road, antagonizing protesters. On this cell phone video shared with NBC 10, we can see a man kneeling on the chest of another person on the ground. It's not clear why. They shouted that George Floyd should have complied with police and that, quote, Black lives matter to no one.
It automatically brought me to tears.
Darian Fennell organized yesterday's peaceful march. When she saw this,
I thought about the young children who were marching behind me. I thought about my son and just how horrible and despicable to do something like that is, how sick an individual has to be to act in that way.
They are cowards. They're losers. And if they don't think I deserve a right to breathe, then I challenge them on their rights.
You know, just listening to what I mean, insensitive, despicable human being to counter protest and then look at just the visuals. He's actually, there's two people, one is laying in the driveway and the other one is kneeling on his neck in an imitation of the George Floyd murder, and is completely mocking, you know, peaceful protesters who are trying to advocate for change. This is a law enforcement officer. This is an example of some of the things that people are angry about. This is a man who actually goes to a prison and is dealing with people who are incarcerated. Just because you're incarcerated, you still have the right to be treated like a human being. It comes into question whether or not, based on his behavior in this video, how effective he is as a correctional officer. Kirk, I know it's a little different, policing and corrections, but they are considered quasi law enforcement officers. I mean, that's, you know, you're talking about trying to make change and you see something like this, like that just speaks to like this craziness of where we're at right now.
It is unconscionable. It displays a lack of humanity and empathy for your fellow human being. And anyone that displays such a lack of empathy and humanity doesn't deserve the honor to wear a uniform and represent law enforcement in any jurisdiction. This man rose his hand in the air and took an oath. I don't know what the oath is in that jurisdiction, but you cannot be a corrections officer or a law enforcement officer without taking an oath. And somewhere embedded in that oath is to uphold the laws of the state. And somehow there is an implication or is implicit that you will treat people fairly. How can we trust someone to treat prisoners and inmates fairly? Law enforcement officers, correction officers are not judges and they're not prosecutors. The job of law enforcement is to deliver an offender or alleged offender to the court. The job of the corrections department is to carry out the sentence of the court. The job of the corrections department is not to continuously punish any human being for no matter what they did. In our system of government, that is for a court to decide. This is unconscionable, displays a complete lack of humanity, and must be rooted out. It dishonors every law enforcement person in this country,
Indeed,
who tries to make an honest living.
Indeed. I couldn't agree with you more. We're going to shift now. We're going to go to the George Floyd case. And this is the case that really just catapulted everything, the movement for police reform. And the Minneapolis Police Department seems to be trying to do something new. Chief Medaria Arredondo is taking an interesting yet controversial approach. He's announced that the department is ending contract negotiations with the police union in an effort for reform. Let's take a look.
Under pressure by protesters demanding radical reform, the embattled Minneapolis police chief vowed change is coming.
We will have a police department that our communities view as legitimate, trusting, and working with their best interests at heart.
The first step, the chief said, would be for the department to withdraw from contract negotiations with the police union to reform use of force and disciplinary procedures.
Did resigning cross your mind over the last 2 weeks at all?
Not at all. History is being written now, and I need to make sure that we are part of the right side of history.
Based on what you saw in that video, do you think race was involved in that?
What I know is that far too often, when we have white officers and black victims, it permeates and goes back to a history of our American policing where race is inextricably linked to that.
Do you think there are racist cops on the force?
I believe that there probably are.
CBS News has learned that prosecutors tried to reach a plea deal with Derek Chauvin before initially charging him with third-degree murder. Arredondo said he refuses to even say Chauvin's name.
Why is that?
Because I don't want to bring any sort of credibility or legitimacy to that.
Interesting concept. So I come from a state when I was policing where we have no collective bargaining. We have a union. It's not mandatory. I think in New York, Kirk, it is mandatory, but where I come from, it's not. Most officers join the union for legal representation if you need it. Sometimes they have some say-so. This is a state, obviously, in Minneapolis and Minnesota that has collective bargaining. And what I really like about the chief's strategy in this is during that process, you have time to really get it right. You can insert some things in there. So he's not suspending completely, like we're not talking to the union. He wants to bring in some outside people to look at this thing, some people that are subject matter experts, to make sure that some reform is included in that, in whatever salary increase or benefits that are usually, negotiated during these contracts. Now, that's important on the front of the things as far as reform goes, but training is always, a part of that. Hopefully, he'll include that in some of those approaches and some of those suggestions. But Kirk, you have some interesting ideas on training, the antiquated way we've been doing things, and you've kind of got a little twist on this thing. Won't you tell us about it?
Sure, absolutely. Broadly speaking, police departments train police officers the same way they have done for the last 50, 60, 70 years, broadly speaking. And while society has moved forward at an exponential pace, training has not. My first step would be to abolish the word training. We are at a point where law enforcement professionals must be educated. And the difference between training and education, training is just teaching somebody to respond to a certain set of stimuli. Education involves thought, reflection, and decision-making. And a lot of what we see in these videos and so forth, poor decision-making based on a lack of education. And I don't mean education on how to love one another. I mean education, understanding sociology, anthropology, global history, American history, conflict resolution, you name it, philosophy. I think that in order to move forward, we should extend police academies from the traditional 5 to 6 months to 2 years, where officers are trained by police officers. There's certainly a benefit to that. And also civilians, right? In this country, we have the greatest faculty, undergraduate and graduate faculty in the world. Let's use them to help train our police departments. The benefits are, number one, this would say police officers would interact with civilians in addition to other police officers from day one. Number two, during this 2-year period, akin to some form of perhaps an undergraduate degree in police science, police officers would be trained. They are out on the street. They perform duties. They come back. They reflect. There is a continued assessment. They go back out on the street. They come back for additional training and continue and also are assessed. It's very difficult to hide for 2 years if you are going to be ineffective. Very, very difficult. And I think that that's the first step with thinking about this as education and basically kind of throwing out the book, so to speak, and starting with a clean slate and bringing policing into the 21st century. Policing at this point is still in the 20th century. And here it is, 2020.
No doubt. Those are great points. You know, and I always have said this to other colleagues when I was working. I wish they had a training module, and the title just says, "What to do when a citizen tells you no." The shock of, "No, officer, I'm not going to show you my ID." And then we always hear, "Oh, I'm only going to tell you one more time." How many times have we heard that? That's the training that I think that officers are just, they're lacking in. They need to hear how, and that's the beginning, in my opinion, of conflict resolution. No, I'm not going to do that. Now, if the officer has a legal right to be where he is or she is, and their legal right to be doing what they're doing, that's where the training comes in my opinion. And I like your idea of a longer training period. I like the idea of a longer police academy. I like the idea of more of an academic approach to it. Sociology, human, nature, this how the mind works and how people are, even cultural differences. All of those things are very important when we start thinking about how do you change, the 20th century policing tactics to the 21st century. We are definitely not there yet, Kirk, and I have to say, I would encourage you to put that out there and try to encourage, whatever platform you can, because I really enjoyed hearing that, and I think that's important that we wipe the slate clean, like you said. Close that book, open up a new book, and let's rewrite how we do this. Because, again, when someone tells a police officer no, we know all too often that goes from 0 to 60 in absolutely no time. In my experience, Kirk, I don't know how many times I've had to actually stop a young officer and tell them, slow down, relax. It's okay. It's not worth, putting hands on somebody for cigarettes. It's not worth putting hands on somebody for a minor traffic infraction, because we have that discretion. We can let people go. We let people go all the time. Police officers let other police officers go on traffic tickets all the time, and family members. That is the training that we need. We need to start from the bottom, wipe this thing clean, start over. We're going to continue working on ways in bringing you stories to try to show a different side of law enforcement. One side being the way things have always been done, and then perhaps a new side of how we can make changes. As we continue looking at cases throughout the country, we'll be back with you next week with more information on keeping the peace. See you next week.